Hi there. In this topic video, we're going to make a distinction between the government's fiscal deficit and the national debt. It's an important distinction for year one macroeconomists to get right first time. So, the fiscal deficit refers to how much the government has to borrow each year. When the government is running a budget deficit, it means that in any given year, total government spending exceeds total tax revenues. And when the government's running a budget deficit or a fiscal deficit, it has to borrow this money through the issue of debt, such as government bonds. So government borrowing is the annual amount that the government must borrow from the financial markets. The national debt, on the other hand, is the accumulated or the total debt owed by the government. Let's have a look at some data for the UK. So, since 2007-2008, the UK government has borrowed money every year. This is expressed as a percentage of GDP, and the peak year for the fiscal deficit was 2009-2010, when the budget deficit was over 10% of UK GDP. Since then, the deficit's come down. It's now estimated to be below 5% of GDP, and the government is hoping to run a balanced budget sometime in 2019 or 2020. What about the debt? Well, here's one way of measuring debt. It's public sector or government net debt, again, as a share of GDP. And you can see that the net debt has been rising most years as a share of GDP, and it's now risen from just under 40% in 2007 to over 80% in 2015-2016. That's a significant increase in government debt. Here are countries with the highest government debt in the world. Japan is the outlier. Their gross government debt as a share of GDP is nearly 250%. And many of you have been following the economic problems and issues surrounding the Greek economy, also a nation with a very high level of government debt, exceeding 170% of GDP. All of these countries have gross government debt more than the size of their annual national income. But here are some countries where the opposite is the case. Saudi Arabia, until recently, is the country with the lowest debt in the world. Although with falling oil prices and collapsing revenues from their exports, the Saudis are now having to go to the international capital markets and borrow money, because the Saudi government is now running a budget deficit. But look at some of the examples here of countries with very low debt. Oftentimes countries rich from oil and gas. Estonia is an interesting country, one of the lowest debts of any of the developed countries inside the European Union. And Chile also is an interesting example. Again, a country that's now part of OECD, but has a very low level of government debt of less than 20% of their GDP. Now, when a government borrows money, it has to issue debt in the form of government bonds. The yield on a government bond is effectively the rate of interest that the government must pay to bondholders for the privilege of borrowing money from them. And this chart shows the yield on 10-year government debt. Quite recent data, and the Greek government, of course, has to spend a lot of money on interest. They're paying just over 7% per year yield on a 10-year Greek government debt. But then there's a big jump to countries like the United States, where the yield is just over 2%, all the way down to Germany and Japan. Those two governments can go to the capital markets and issue more debt, more government debt, at a 10-year yield of just 0.5% or less. What about the UK? Well, I think the story for the UK, again, is of low yields on debt. This chart shows the yield in percentage terms on 5-year bonds in blue, 10-year bonds in red, and a 20-year bond, much the longer forms of borrowing, in green. Effectively, at the end of 2015, the UK government could go to the capital markets if it needed to borrow money for the long term at a low yield of around 2% or less. yields on the national debt in the UK are at historically low levels. So what we've done in this topic video is think about the distinction between a fiscal deficit, which is the annual amount the government has to borrow, and the national debt, which is the accumulated level of government debt. Hope you found this useful and illuminating. Check out our website for more videos.